in church. Often I try to analyze the quality of its silences. Is this where God hides from my searching? I have stopped to listen, after the few people have gone, to the air recomposing itself for vigil. It has waited like this since the stones grouped themselves about it. These are the hard ribs of a body that our prayers have failed to animate. Shadows advance from their corners to take possession of places the light held for an hour. The bats resume their business. The uneasiness of the pews ceases. There is no other sound in the darkness but the sound of a man breathing, testing his faith on emptiness, nailing his questions one by one to an untenanted cross.
In the Anglican Cycle of Prayer, we pray for the church in which this distinguished poet R.S. Thomas served, the Church in Wales. There is evidence of Christianity existing in Wales centuries before the arrival of St. Augustine of Canterbury in 597. Roman soldiers Julius and Aaron of Caerleon were martyred in the early 3rd century, likely during the persecution of Christians led by Septimius Severus, the same persecution responsible for the martyrdom of St. Alban. The ancient Christians of Wales were part of the Celtic stream of Christianity which thrived in Ireland and Scotland and came to a head with Roman Christianity at the Synod of Whitby in 664. The Celtic Christians of Wales were deeply influenced by the desert spirituality of Egypt and Palestine, which came to Britain via Gaul through the writings of John Cassian. Tribal communities and kingdoms formed into dioceses and monastic communities which focused on scholarship and prayer and mission. One of the early missionaries was St. David, the patron saint of Wales. The mother churches at the center of these territories gave the regions their name, which is why so many Welsh places began with the prefix Llan, which means church, followed by the name of its founder. For example, Llandaf Cathedral. During the English Reformation, the monasteries were dissolved, and although Henry VIII's Act of Union in 1536 deprived the Welsh language of its official status, the Book of Common Prayer and the entire Bible were translated and published into Welsh in 1567 and 1588, respectively, thus saving the language from extinction. From the 1950s onward, the Church became much more than the Church of England in Wales and began to assume a leading role as the guardian of the use of the Welsh language in worship. The Church in Wales is a bilingual church, having services in both English and Welsh. As the Church faces significant decline in membership, former Archbishop Barry Morgan says the Church is often prepared to think radically, but it is reluctant to implement consequent recommendations. And when the Church takes decisive actions, it can fail to follow them through to their logical conclusions. Wales was one of the first provinces to ordain women to the diaconate in 1980, but it was not until 1997 that the canon to ordain them priests was passed, having failed in 1994. And so Wales was the last Anglican province in the British Isles to ordain women to the priesthood. Also, an attempt to open the episcopate to women priests was defeated in 2008. However, in 2019, the Reverend Cherry Van was elected the Bishop of Monmouth, and she lives with her civil partner, Wendy. The challenge, Barry Morgan writes, is to see tradition as a dynamic process, embracing creative innovation and challenging members to new ways of thinking for the sake of the gospel. And yet, compared with the problems faced by many provinces of the Anglican Communion, those of the province of Wales fade into insignificance. Anglican churches in many parts of the world face persecution, civil unrest, famine, natural disasters, poverty, and war. The Church in Wales ought therefore to be a church that counts its blessings. Its history also ought to give it a sense of perspective and confidence to resolve successfully the issues which it faces, as its leaders and members did in earlier times. Former Archbishop Morgan would likely encourage the Church in Wales to emulate the Welsh priest R.S. Thomas and to analyze the quality of silences to stop and listen to the God whose presence in the darkness and in a solitary person's breath may be part of the answer to the nagging questions we nail to the cross. Fun fact, the first Archbishop of Canterbury to come from a province outside of the Church of England came from the Church in Wales, Rowan Williams, who served as Archbishop of Canterbury from 2002 to 2012.